A horse screamed in the black water of Lake Texcoco, and Hernán Cortés went down with it, dragged from the saddle by a dozen hands and pulled beneath the surface before he could draw his sword. It was the night of June 30th, 1520, on the Tlaxcala causeway, in the chaos that Spanish survivors would call La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The conquistadors were fleeing Tenochtitlan, the great island capital of the Mexica, weighed down by looted gold, and hunted along the narrow raised road by warriors in canoes. In the true history we know, Cortés survived that crossing and lived to return and destroy the city. But here on this causeway, the man who held the entire Spanish enterprise together did not reach the far shore. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The captains around him fell in the same press. Those who knew the roads, who spoke the languages, who commanded the loyalty of frightened men, gone in the span of minutes. A column without a head does not retreat, it scatters. And as the survivors broke apart across the water, something was already changing in the dark that none of them could see. The thing that would matter most in the years ahead was not the gold lost in the lake. It was that the one indispensable man was gone, and no one had been ready to replace him. Pedro de Alvarado lived. The captain whose massacre of Mexican nobles during the festival of Tlaxcala had lit the fuse of this revolt now found himself the senior figure among a few hundred shattered, starving men. He led them east, away from the lake, toward Tlaxcala, the mountain confederacy that had fought the Spanish in 1519 and then allied with them against the hated Mexica. The Tlaxcalans took them in, as they had before, but the calculation had changed. The alliance with Cortés had been a wager on a particular man and his particular promise, that together they could break Tenochtitlan. That man was dead. Alvarado could not command a renewed campaign because he could not command much of anything. He had no royal authority, no clear line of succession, no plan beyond survival. Xicotencatl the Younger, the Tlaxcalan war leader, watched the broken Spaniards eat his people's maize and asked the obvious question: what exactly were these foreigners worth now? An alliance is a transaction, and one side had just lost almost everything it brought to the table. The Tlaxcalan elders did not abandon their guests outright, but they stopped planning around them. Across the water, in the city that had held, a different kind of work was beginning. Cuitlahuac, brother of the dead Moctezuma, had been elected Tlatoani as the uprising reached its height, and now he consolidated the resistance with a clarity born of having watched the enemy nearly win. He did not treat the expulsion as a triumph to be celebrated and forgotten. He treated it as instruction. He ordered that captured Spanish weapons be studied, the steel blades that did not shatter, the crossbows, the few firearms, the strange, tall animals that had carried men into battle. He had his commanders examine how the foreigners fought, how they used the causeways, and above all, how they had turned the Tlaxcala and other subject peoples against Tenochtitlan. That last lesson was the sharpest. The Mexica had not been defeated by a few hundred Castilians. They had been nearly defeated by their own enemies, marshaled by outsiders who understood the valley's hatreds. To survive the next time, the alliance would have to be more than a tribute empire that bred resentment. The bridges could be removed, the grievances could not, unless someone chose to address them. Then the sickness came, exactly as it did in the history we know. Smallpox, carried from the coast by a man of the Narvaez expedition, swept through the Valley of Mexico in the autumn of 1520. It did not care which timeline it entered. It killed without regard for rank or courage, and among the dead was Cuitlahuac himself, struck down after only months in power. In our history, this double-blow plague and the loss of a capable leader helped open the way for the Spanish return. Here, the plague was just as merciless, but the political ground beneath it was firmer. The state did not collapse into the vacuum because the work of reorganization had already begun and did not depend on one life. Cuauhtémoc, the young noble and commander, inherited a polity already bent toward resistance, its commanders already drilled in what the foreigners could do. He buried a third of his people that winter and took up a throne over a grieving, hardened city. The disease had cut the alliance to the bone, but it had not cut out its will, and that distinction would decide everything. The Caribbean did not forget the mainland. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba who had sent Narvaez to arrest Cortés in the first place, now saw the Central Valley as a prize lying open. Other captains saw it too. Over the following years, expedition after expedition pushed inland from the coast, drawn by the rumor of gold-rich cities on a lake. Each one broke against a problem the conquistadors of legend never faced. The alliance was forewarned. Its scouts watched the coastal landings. Its commanders knew the value of the removable bridges and the canoes that turned a causeway into a killing channel. And the native allies who had once flocked to the Spanish banner now hesitated, because the foreigners no longer looked like winners. A Tlaxcala uncertain of its bet is a Tlaxcala that holds back its warriors. Without tens of thousands of indigenous allies, a few hundred Spaniards on hostile ground were not an army of conquest. They were a column waiting to be cut apart on a road in the dark. The valley had already shown it could do that once. What Spain could hold, it held at the edges. Trading posts and footholds appeared along the Gulf Coast, where ships could resupply and where local lords found advantage in dealing with the newcomers. But the Central Valley remained beyond reach, and in the halls of Charles V's government, the arithmetic of empire began to assert itself. The Holy Roman Emperor and King of Castile ruled lands that stretched across Europe, and his attention and his soldiers were always demanded elsewhere. His officials in the Indies sent reports that did not promise easy victory but counted the dead from failed marches inland. There comes a point at which a distant prize is judged not worth the blood, and the conversation shifts from conquest to commerce. If the cities on the lake could not be taken, perhaps they could be traded with. The men who governed empires were, in the end, men who kept ledgers, and the ledger for central Mexico had stopped balancing. So contact came anyway, but on terms the alliance set, not the ones imposed in our history. The lords of the valley were not isolationists. They understood that the foreigners brought things of value: steel, new tools, animals, knowledge of a wider world that had arrived on their shores, whether they willed it or not. They chose to let some of it in. Select traders were admitted to the coastal markets and carefully to the valley itself. A handful of friars came and were heard, their teachings weighed rather than enforced at sword's point. Craftsmen who could work iron found patrons among the Mexican nobility. But the alliance controlled the gates. It decided who entered the heart of its territory, how many, for how long, and to what purpose. This was the inversion of everything the conquest had been. The exchange of metal, faith, and craft still happened, because contact once made cannot be undone. What changed was whose hand rested on the door. A century on, a reformed Mesoamerican state still stood in the Valley of Mexico. Neither the Empire Moctezuma had ruled, nor a colony of Castile, but something new shaped by the pressure of survival. It had reckoned with smallpox and the waves of disease that followed, paying in lives no decree could prevent. It had learned to play rival European powers against one another, admitting Spanish, and later other, traders without surrendering to any. Internally, it had changed, the old tribute system loosened by the hard knowledge that resentful subjects make an empire brittle. It was not a paradise, and it had not been destined. Its survival had turned on a single night, a single man pulled into the water, 1,000 contingencies that might have fallen the other way. In the history we actually inhabit, Cortés reached the far shore, returned with allies and ships, and Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. The difference between that world and this one was measured in the length of a causeway and the reach of a Mexica warrior's arm. History does not announce its hinges while they are turning. It only shows us, long afterward, how narrowly the door swung shut, and how easily, on one dark night over the water, it might have stayed open.